Edition 1 of Black Spirits and White, a book of ghost stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Gauntz. Black Spirits and White, a book of ghost stories by Ralph Adams Cram. Number 252, Rue Monsieur le Prince. When in May 1886 I found myself at last in Paris, I naturally determined to throw myself on the charity of an old chum of mine, Eugene Marie Dardèche, who had forsaken Boston a year or more ago on receiving word of the death of an aunt who had left him such property as she possessed. I fancy this windfall surprised him not a little, for the relations between the aunt and nephew had never been cordial, judging from Eugene's remarks touching the lady, who was, it seems, a more or less wicked and witch-like old person, with a penchant for black magic, at least such was the common report. Why she should leave all her property to Dardèche no one could tell, unless it was that she felt his rather hobbledehoy tendencies toward Buddhism and occultism might someday lead him to her own unhallowed height of questionable illumination. To be sure, Dardèche reviled her as a bad old woman, being himself in that state of enthusiastic exultation which sometimes accompanies a boyish fancy for occultism. But in spite of his distant and repellent attitude, Mademoiselle Bly de Tartas made him her sole heir, to the violent wrath of a questionable old party known to infamy as the Tsar Torrevieja, the king of the sorcerers. This malevolent old portent, whose grey and crafty face was often seen in the Rue Monsieur le Prince during the life of Mademoiselle Tartas, had, it seems, fully expected to enjoy her small wealth after her death, and when it appeared that she had left him only the contents of the gloomy old house in the Quartier Latin, giving the house itself and all else of which she died possessed to her nephew in America, the Tsar proceeded to remove everything from the place, and then to curse it elaborately and comprehensively, together with all those who should ever dwell therein, whereupon he disappeared. This final episode was the last word I received from Eugene, but I knew the number of the house, 252 Rue Monsieur le Prince. So, after a day or two given to a first cursory survey of Paris, I started across the Seine to find Eugene and compel him to do the honors of the city. Everyone who knows the Latin Quarter knows the Rue Monsieur le Prince, running up the hill towards the garden of the Luxembourg. It is full of queer houses and odd corners, or was in '86, and certainly number 252 was, when I found it, quite as queer as any. It was nothing but a doorway, a black arch of old stone between and under two new houses painted yellow. The effect of this bit of 17th century masonry, with its dirty old doors and rusty broken lanterns sticking gaunt and grim out over the narrow sidewalk, was, in its frame of fresh plaster, sinister in the extreme. I wondered if I had made a mistake in the number. It was quite evident that no one lived behind those cobwebs. I went into the doorway of one of the new hotels and interviewed the concierge. No, Monsieur Dardèche did not live there, though to be sure he owned the mansion. He himself resided in Meudon, in the country house of the late Mademoiselle de Tartas. Would Monsieur like the number and the street? Monsieur would like them extremely, so I took the card that the concierge wrote for me, and forthwith started for the river, in order that I might take a steamboat for Meudon. By one of those coincidences which happen so often, being quite inexplicable, I had not gone 20 paces down the street before I ran directly into the arms of Eugene Dardèche. In 3 minutes we were sitting in the queer little garden of the Chien Bleu, drinking vermouth and absinthe and talking it all over. "You do not live in your aunt's house?" I said at last, interrogatively. "No, but if this sort of thing keeps on, I shall have to. I like Meudon much better, and the house is perfect, all furnished, and nothing in it newer than the last century. You must come out with me tonight and see it. I have a jolly good room fixed up for my Buddha. But there is something wrong with this house opposite. I can't keep a tenant in it, not 4 days. I have had 3, all within 6 months. But the stories have gone around, and a man would as soon think of hiring the Coeur de Comte to live in number 252. It is notorious. The fact is, it is haunted in the worst way." I laughed and ordered more vermouth. "That is all right. It is haunted all the same, or enough to keep it empty. And the funny part is that no one knows how it is haunted. Nothing is ever seen, nothing heard. As far as I can find out, people just have the horrors there, and have them so bad they have to go to the hospital afterwards. I have one ex-tenant in the beset now. So the house stands empty, and as it covers considerable ground and is taxed for a lot, I don't know what to do about it. I think I'll either give it to that child of sin, Torrevieja, or else go and live in it myself. I shouldn't mind the ghosts, I am sure. Did you ever stay there? No, but I have always intended to. And in fact, I came up here today to see a couple of rake-hell fellows I know, Fargeau and Duchesne, doctors in the clinical hospital beyond here, up by the Parc Montsouris. They promised they would spend the night with me sometime in my aunt's house, which is called around here, you must know, La Bouche d'Enfer, and I thought perhaps they would make it this week if they can get off duty. Come up with me while I see them, and then we can go across the river to Véfours and have some luncheon. Or you can get your things at the Chatham and we will go out to Meudon, where, of course, you will spend the night with me. The plan suited me perfectly, so we went up to the hospital, found Fargeau, who declared that he and Duchesne were ready for anything, the nearer the real Bouche d'Enfer the better, that the following Thursday they would both be off duty for the night, and that on that day they would join in an attempt to outwit the devil and clear up the mystery of number 252. "Does Monsieur l'Américain go with us?" asked Fargeau. "Why, of course," I replied. "I intend to go, and you must not refuse me, Dardèche. I decline to be put off. Here is a chance for you to do the honors of your city in a manner which is faultless. Show me a real live ghost, and I will forgive Paris for having lost the Jardin Mobile." So it was settled. Later we went down to Meudon and ate dinner in the terrace room of the villa, which was all that Ardèche had said and more, so utterly was its atmosphere that of the 17th century. At dinner, Eugene told me more about his late aunt and the queer goings-on in the old house. Mademoiselle Bly lived, it seems, all alone, except for one female servant of her own age, a severe, taciturn creature with massive Breton features and a Breton tongue whenever she vouchsafed to use it. No one ever was seen to enter the door of number 252 except Jean, the servant, and the Tsar Torrevieja, the latter coming constantly from none knew whither, and always entering, never leaving. Indeed, the neighbors who for 11 years had watched the old sorcerer sidle crabwise up to the bell almost every day, declared vociferously that never had he been seen to leave the house. Once, when they decided to keep absolute guard, the watcher, none other than Maître Garceau of the Chien Bleu, after keeping his eyes fixed on the door from 10 o'clock one morning when the Tsar arrived until 4 in the afternoon, during which time the door was unopened. He knew this, for had he not gummed a 10-centime stamp over the joint, and was not the stamp unbroken? Nearly fell down when the sinister figure of Torrevieja slid wickedly by him with a dry "Pardon, monsieur," and disappeared again through the black doorway. This was curious, for number 252 was entirely surrounded by houses, its only windows opening on a courtyard into which no eye could look from the hotels of the Rue Monsieur le Prince and the Rue de l'École, and the mystery was one of the choice possessions of the Latin Quarter. Once a year the austerity of the place was broken, and the denizens of the whole quarter stood open-mouthed watching many carriages drive up to number 252, many of them private, not a few with crests on the door panels, from all of them descending veiled female figures and men with coat collars turned up. Then followed curious sounds of music from within, and those whose houses joined the blank walls of number 252 became for the moment popular, for by placing the ear against the wall strange music could distinctly be heard, and the sound of monotonous chanting voices now and then. By dawn the last guest would have departed, and for another year the hotel of Mademoiselle de Tartas was ominously silent. Eugene declared that he believed it was a celebration of Walpurgisnacht, and certainly appearances favored such a fancy. A queer thing about the whole affair is, he said, the fact that everyone in the streets swears that about a month ago, while I was out in Concarneau for a visit, just as when my revered aunt was in the flesh, the house was perfectly empty, as I tell you, so it is quite possible that the good people were enjoying a hallucination. I must acknowledge that these stories did not reassure me. In fact, as Thursday came near, I began to regret a little my determination to spend the night in the house. I was too vain to back down, however, and the perfect coolness of the two doctors who ran down Tuesday to Meudon to make a few arrangements caused me to swear that I would die of fright before I would flinch. I suppose that I believed more or less in ghosts. I am sure now that I am older I believe in them. There are in fact few things I cannot believe. 2 or 3 inexplicable things had happened to me, and although this was before my adventure with Rendell in Peastom, I had a strong predisposition to believe some things that I could not explain, wherein I was out of sympathy with the age. Well, to come to the memorable night of the 12th of June, we had made our preparations, and after depositing a big bag inside the doors of number 252, went across to the Chien Bleu, where Fargeau and Duchesne turned up promptly, and we sat down to the best dinner Père Garceau could create. I remember I hardly felt that the conversation was in good taste. It began with various stories of Indian fakirs and Oriental jugglery, matters in which Eugene was curiously well read, swerved to the horrors of the Great Sepoy Mutiny, and thus to reminiscences of the dissecting room. By this time we had drunk more or less, and Duchesne launched into a photographic and Zola-esque account of the only time, as he said, when he was possessed by the panic of fear. Namely, one night many years ago when he was locked by accident into the dissecting room of the Lucine, together with several cadavers of a rather unpleasant nature. I ventured to protest mildly against the choice of subjects, the result being a perfect carnival of horrors, so that when we finally drank our last crème de cacao and started for La Bouche d'Enfer, my nerves were in a somewhat rocky condition. It was just 10 o'clock when we came into the street. A hot, dead wind drifted in great puffs through the city, and ragged masses of vapor swept the purple sky. An unsavory night altogether, one of those nights of hopeless lassitude when one feels, if one is at home, like doing nothing but drink mint juleps and smoke cigarettes. Eugene opened the creaking door and tried to light one of the lanterns, but the gusty wind blew out every match, and we finally had to close the outer doors before we could get a light. At last we had all the lanterns going, and I began to look around curiously. We were in a long, vaulted passage, partly carriageway, partly footpath, perfectly bare but for the street refuse which had drifted in with the eddying winds. Beyond lay the courtyard, a curious place rendered more curious still by the fitful moonlight and the flashing of 4 dark lanterns. The place had evidently been once a most noble palace. Opposite rose the oldest portion, a 3-story wall of the time of Francis I, with a great wisteria vine covering half. The wings on either side were more modern, 17th century, and ugly, while towards the street was nothing but a flat, unbroken wall. The great bare court, littered with bits of paper blown in by the wind, fragments of packing cases and straw, mysterious with flashing lights and flaunting shadows, while low masses of torn vapor drifted overhead, hiding, then revealing the stars, and all in absolute silence. Not even the sounds of the streets entering this prison-like place was weird and uncanny in the extreme. I must confess that I already began to feel a slight disposition towards the horrors, but with that curious inconsequence which so often happens in the case of those who are deliberately growing scared, I could think of nothing more reassuring than those delicious verses of Lewis Carroll's. Just the place for a snark, I have said it twice, that alone should encourage the crew. Just the place for a snark, I have said it thrice, what I tell you 3 times is true, which kept repeating themselves over and over in my brain with feverish insistence. Even the medical students had stopped their chaffing and were studying the surroundings gravely. One thing is certain, said Fargeau. Anything might have happened here without the slightest chance of discovery. Did you ever see such a perfect place for lawlessness? And anything might happen here now with the same certainty of impunity, continued Duchesne, lighting his pipe, the snap of the match making us all start. Dardèche, your lamented relative, was certainly well fixed. She had full scope here for her traditional experiments in demonology. Curse me if I don't believe that those same traditions were more or less founded on fact, said Eugene. I never saw this court under these conditions before, but I could believe anything now. What's that? Nothing but a door slamming, said Duchesne loudly. Well, I wish doors wouldn't slam in houses that have been empty 11 months. It is irritating, and Duchesne slipped his arm through mine. But we must take things as they come. Remember, we have to deal not only with the spectral lumber left here by your scarlet aunt, but as well with the supererogatory curse of that hellcat Torrevieja. Come on, let's get inside before the hour arrives for the sheeted dead to squeak and gibber in these lonely halls. Light your pipes. Your tobacco is a sure protection against your horse and dead bodies. Light up and move on. We opened the hall door and entered a vaulted stone vestibule, full of dust and cobwebby. There is nothing on this floor, said Eugene, except servants' rooms and offices, and I don't believe there is anything wrong with them. I never heard there was, anyway. Let's go upstairs. So far as we could see, the house was apparently perfectly uninteresting inside, all 18th century work, the facade of the main building being, with the vestibule, the only portion of the Francis I work. The place was burned during the Terror, said Eugene, for my great-uncle, from whom Mademoiselle de Tartas inherited it, was a good and true royalist. He went to Spain after the Revolution, and did not come back until the accession of Charles X, when he restored the house and then died enormously old. This explains why it is all so new. The old Spanish sorcerer to whom Mademoiselle de Tartas had left her personal property had done his work thoroughly. The house was absolutely empty. Even the wardrobes and bookcases built in had been carried away. We went through room after room, finding all absolutely dismantled. Only the windows and doors with their casings, the parquet floors, and the florid Renaissance mantels remaining. I feel better, remarked Fargeau. The house may be haunted, but it don't look it, certainly. It is the most respectable place imaginable. Just you wait, replied Eugene. These are only the state apartments which my aunt seldom used, except perhaps on her annual Walpurgis nut. Come upstairs and I will show you a better mise-en-scène. On this floor, the rooms fronting the court, the sleeping rooms, were quite small. They are the bad rooms all the same, said Eugene. 4 of them, all just as ordinary in appearance as those below. A corridor ran behind them connecting with the wing corridor, and from this opened a door unlike any of the other doors in that it was covered with green baize, somewhat moth-eaten. Eugene selected a key from the bunch he carried, unlocked the door, and with some difficulty forced it to swing inward. It was as heavy as the door of a safe. We are now, he said, on the very threshold of hell itself. These rooms in here were my scarlet aunt's unholy of unholies. I never let them with the rest of the house, but kept them as a curiosity. I only wish Torrevieja had kept out. As it was, he looted them, as he did the rest of the house, and nothing is left but the walls and ceiling and floor. They are something, however, and may suggest what the former condition must have been. Tremble and enter. The first apartment was a kind of anteroom, a cube of perhaps 20 feet each way, without windows, and with no doors except that by which we entered and another to the right. Walls, floor, and ceiling were covered with a black lacquer, brilliantly polished, that flashed the light of our lanterns in 1,000 intricate reflections. It was like the inside of an enormous Japanese box, and about as empty. From this we passed to another room, and here we nearly dropped our lanterns. The room was circular, 30 feet or so in diameter, covered by a hemispherical dome. Walls and ceiling were dark blue, spotted with gold stars, and reaching from floor to floor across the dome stretched a colossal figure in red lacquer of a nude woman kneeling, her legs reaching out along the floor on either side, her head touching the lintel of the door through which we had entered, her arms forming its sides, with the forearms extended and stretching along the walls until they met the long feet. The most astounding, misshapen, absolutely terrifying thing I think I ever saw. From the navel hung a great white object, like the traditional rose egg of the Arabian Nights. The floor was of red lacquer, and in it was inlaid a pentagram the size of the room, made of wide strips of brass. In the center of this pentagram was a circular disc of black stone, slightly saucer-shaped, with a small outlet in the middle. The effect of this room was simply crushing, with this gigantic red figure crouched over it all, the staring eyes fixed on one no matter what his position. None of us spoke, so oppressive was the whole thing. The third room was like the first in dimensions, but instead of being black, it was entirely sheathed with plates of brass, walls, ceiling, and floor, tarnished now and turning green, but still brilliant under the lantern light. In the middle stood an oblong altar of porphyry, its longer dimensions on the axis of the suite of rooms, and at one end, opposite the range of doors, a pedestal of black basalt. This was all. 3 rooms stranger than these, even in their emptiness, it would be hard to imagine. In Egypt, in India, they would not be entirely out of place, but here in Paris, in a commonplace hotel, in the Rue Monsieur le Prince, they were incredible. We retraced our steps. Eugene closed the iron door with its baize covering, and we went into one of the front chambers and sat down, looking at each other. "Nice party, your aunt," said Fargeau. "Nice old party, with amiable tastes. I'm glad we are not to spend the night in those rooms." "What do you suppose she did there?" inquired Duchesne. "I know more or less about black art, but that series of rooms is too much for me." "My impression is," said Dardèche, "that the brazen room was a kind of sanctuary containing some image or other on the basalt base, while the stone in front was really an altar. What the nature of the sacrifice might be, I don't even guess. The round room may have been used for invocations and incantations. The pentagram looks like it. Anyway, it is all just about as queer and fin de siècle as I can well imagine. Look here, it is nearly 12. Let's dispose of ourselves if we are going to hunt this thing down." The 4 chambers on this floor of the old house were those said to be haunted, the wings being quite innocent, and, so far as we knew, the floors below. It was arranged that we should each occupy a room, leaving the doors open with the lights burning, and at the slightest cry or knock we were all to rush at once to the room from which the warning sound might come. There was no communication between the rooms, to be sure, but as the doors all opened into the corridor, every sound was plainly audible. The last room fell to me, and I looked it over carefully. It seemed innocent enough, a commonplace, square, rather lofty Parisian sleeping room, finished in wood painted white with a small marble mantel, a dusty floor of inlaid maple and cherry, walls hung with an ordinary French paper, apparently quite new, and 2 deeply embrasured windows looking out on the court. I opened the swinging sash with some trouble, and sat down in the window seat with my lantern beside me trained on the only door, which gave on the corridor. The wind had gone down, and it was very still without, still and hot. The masses of luminous vapor were gathering thickly overhead, no longer urged by the gusty wind. The great masses of rank wisteria leaves, with here and there a second blossoming of purple flowers, hung dead over the window in the sluggish air. Across the roofs I could hear the sound of a belated fiacre in the streets below. I filled my pipe again and waited. For a time the voices of the men in the other rooms were a companionship, and at first I shouted to them now and then, but my voice echoed rather unpleasantly through the long corridors, and had a suggestive way of reverberating around the left wing beside me, and coming out at a broken window at its extremity like the voice of another man. I soon gave up my attempts at conversation, and devoted myself to the task of keeping awake. It was not easy. Why did I eat that lettuce salad at Père Garceau's? I should have known better. It was making me irresistibly sleepy, and wakefulness was absolutely necessary. It was certainly gratifying to know that I could sleep, that my courage was by me to that extent, but in the interests of science I must keep awake. But almost never, it seemed, had sleep looked so desirable. 100 times nearly I would doze for an instant, only to awake with a start and find my pipe gone out. Nor did the exertion of relighting it pull me together. I struck my match mechanically, and with the first puff dropped off again. It was most vexing. I got up and walked around the room. It was most annoying. My cramped position had almost put both my legs to sleep. I could hardly stand. I felt numb as though with cold. There was no longer any sound from the other rooms, nor from without. I sank down in my window seat. How dark it was growing. I turned up the lantern. That pipe again, how obstinately it kept going out, and my last match was gone. The lantern, too, was that going out? I lifted my hand to turn it up again. It felt like lead, and fell beside me. Then I awoke, absolutely. I remembered the story of the haunters and the haunted. This was the horror. I tried to rise, to cry out. My body was like lead, my tongue was paralyzed. I could hardly move my eyes, and the light was going out. There was no question about that. Darker and darker yet, little by little, the pattern of the paper was swallowed up in the advancing night. A prickling numbness gathered in every nerve. My right arm slipped without feeling from my lap to my side, and I could not raise it. It swung helpless. A thin, keen humming began in my head like the cicadas on a hillside in September. The darkness was coming fast. Yes, this was it. Something was subjecting me, body and mind, to slow paralysis. Physically, I was already dead. If I could only hold my mind, my consciousness, I might still be safe, but could I? Could I resist the mad horror of this silence, the deepening dark, the creeping numbness? I knew that, like the man in the ghost story, my only safety lay here. It had come at last. My body was dead. I could no longer move my eyes. They were fixed in that last look on the place where the door had been, now only a deepening of the dark. Utter night. The last flicker of the lantern was gone. I sat and waited. My mind was still keen, but how long would it last? There was a limit even to the endurance of the utter panic of fear. Then the end began. In the velvet blackness came two white eyes, milky, opalescent, small, far away. Awful eyes, like a dead dream. More beautiful than I can describe, the flakes of white flame moving from the perimeter inward, disappearing in the center, like a never-ending flow of opal water into a circular tunnel. I could not have moved my eyes had I possessed the power. They devoured the fearful, beautiful things that grew slowly, slowly larger, fixed on me, advancing, growing more beautiful. The white flakes of light sweeping more swiftly into the blazing vortices. The awful fascination deepening in its insane intensity as the white, vibrating eyes grew nearer, larger. Like a hideous and implacable engine of death, the eyes of the unknown horror swelled and expanded until they were close before me. Enormous, terrible, and I felt a slow, cold, wet breath propelled with mechanical regularity against my face, enveloping me in its fetid mist, in its charnel house deadliness. With ordinary fear goes always a physical terror, but with me in the presence of this unspeakable thing was only the utter and awful terror of the mind, the mad fear of a prolonged and ghostly nightmare. Again and again I tried to shriek, to make some noise, but physically I was utterly dead. I could only feel myself go mad with the terror of hideous death. The eyes were close on me, their movement so swift that they seemed to be but palpitating flames. The dead breath was around me like the depths of the deepest sea. Suddenly a wet, icy mouth like that of a dead cuttlefish, shapeless, jelly-like, fell over mine. The horror began slowly to draw my life from me, but as enormous and shuddering folds of palpitating jelly swept sinuously around me, my will came back. My body awoke with the reaction of final fear, and I closed with the nameless death that enfolded me. What was it that I was fighting? My arms sunk through the unresisting mass that was turning me to ice. Moment by moment, new folds of cold jelly swept around me, crushing me with the force of titans. I fought to wrest my mouth from this awful thing that sealed it, but if ever I succeeded and caught a single breath, the wet, sucking mass closed over my face again before I could cry out. I think I fought for hours, desperately, insanely, in a silence that was more hideous than any sound. Fought until I felt final death at hand, until the memory of all my life rushed over me like a flood, until I no longer had strength to wrench my face from that hellish succubus, until with a last mechanical struggle I fell and yielded to death. Then I heard a voice say, "If he is dead, I can never forgive myself. I was to blame." Another replied, "He is not dead. I know we can save him if only we reach the hospital in time. Drive like hell, coacher. 20 francs for you if you get there in 3 minutes." Then there was night again and nothingness, until I suddenly awoke and started around. I lay in a hospital ward, very white and sunny. Some yellow fleur-de-lis stood beside the head of the pallet, and a tall sister of mercy sat by my side. To tell the story in a few words, I was in the Hotel Dieu, where the men had taken me that fearful night of the 12th of June. I asked for Fargeau or Duchesne, and by the latter came, and sitting beside the bed told me all that I did not know. It seems that they had sat, each in his room, hour after hour, hearing nothing, very much bored and disappointed. Soon after 2 o'clock, Fargeau, who was in the next room, called to me to ask if I was awake. I gave no reply, and after shouting once or twice, he took his lantern and came to investigate. The door was locked on the inside. He instantly called Dardèche and Duchesne, and together they hurled themselves against the door. It resisted. Within, they could hear irregular footsteps dashing here and there with heavy breathing. Although frozen with terror, they fought to destroy the door and finally succeeded using a great slab of marble that formed the shelf of the mantel in Fargeau's room. As the door crashed in, they were suddenly hurled back against the walls of the corridor as though by an explosion. The lanterns were extinguished, and they found themselves in utter silence and darkness. As soon as they recovered from the shock, they leaped into the room and fell over my body in the middle of the floor. They lighted one of the lanterns and saw the strangest sight that can be imagined. The floor and walls, to the height of about 6 feet, were running with something that seemed like stagnant water, thick, glutinous, sickening. As for me, I was drenched with the same cursed liquid. The odor of musk was nauseating. They dragged me away, stripped off my clothing, wrapped me in their coats, and hurried to the hospital, thinking me perhaps dead. Soon after sunrise, Dardèche left the hospital, being assured that I was in a fair way to recovery with time, and with Fargeau went up to examine by daylight the traces of the adventure that was so nearly fatal. They were too late. Fire engines were coming down the street as they passed the academy. A neighbor rushed up to Dardèche. "Oh, monsieur, what misfortune, yet what fortune! It is true, la bouche d'enfer. I beg pardon, the residence of the lamented Mademoiselle de Tartas was burned, but not wholly, only the ancient building. The wings were saved, and for that great credit is due the brave firemen. Monsieur will remember them, no doubt." It was quite true. Whether a forgotten lantern overturned in the excitement had done the work, or whether the origin of the fire was more supernatural, it was certain that the mouth of hell was no more. A last engine was pumping slowly as Dardèche came up. 6 limp and 1 distended hose stretched through the porte-cochere, and within only the façade of Francis I remained, draped still with the black stems of the wisteria. Beyond lay a great vacancy, where thin smoke was rising slowly. Every floor was gone, and the strange halls of Mademoiselle Bly de Tartas were only a memory. With Dardèche I visited the place last year, but in the stead of the ancient walls was then only a new and ordinary building, fresh and respectable. Yet the wonderful stories of the old bouche d'enfer still lingered in the quarter, and will hold there, I do not doubt, until the day of judgment. End of number 252, Rue Monsieur le Prince. Section 2 of Black Spirits and White, a Book of Ghost Stories by Ralph Adams Cram. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Gauntz. In Kropsberg Keep. To the traveler from Innsbruck to Munich, up the lovely valley of the Silver Inn, many castles appear, one after another, each on its beetling cliff or gentle hill, appear and disappear, melting into the dark fir trees that grow so thickly on every side. Lannick, Lichtwer, Ratholz, Trotzberg, Matzen, Kropsberg, gathering close around the entrance to the dark and wonderful Zillerthal. But to us, Tom Rendell and myself, there are 2 castles only, not the gorgeous and princely Ambrus, nor the noble old Trotzberg with its crowded treasures of solemn and splendid medievalism, but little Matzen, where eager hospitality forms the new life of a never-dead chivalry, and Kropsberg, ruined, tottering, blasted by fire and smitten with grievous years, a dead thing and haunted, full of strange legends and eloquent of mystery and tragedy. We were visiting the Von Sees at Matzen and gaining our first wondering knowledge of the courtly, cordial castle life in the Tyrol, of the gentle and delicate hospitality of noble Austrians. Brixleg had ceased to be but a mark on a map and had become a place of rest and delight, a home for homeless wanderers on the face of Europe, while Schloss Matzen was a synonym for all that was gracious and kindly and beautiful in life. The days moved on in a golden round of riding and driving and shooting, down to Landl and Thiersee for chamois, across the river to the magic Achensee, up the Zillerthal, across the Schmerner Joch, even to the railway station at Steinach. And in the evenings after the late dinners in the upper hall where the sleepy hounds leaned against our chairs looking at us with suppliant eyes, in the evenings when the fire was dying away in the hooded fireplace in the library, stories and legends and fairy tales, while the stiff old portraits changed countenance constantly under the flickering firelight, and the sound of the drifting inn came softly across the meadows far below. If ever I tell the story of Schloss Matzen, then will be the time to paint the too inadequate picture of this fair oasis in the desert of travel and tourists and hotels. But just now it is Kropsberg the Silent that is of greater importance, for it was only in Matzen that the story was told by Fraulein E., the gold-haired niece of Frau von C., one hot evening in July, when we were sitting in the great west window of the drawing-room after a long ride up the Stahlenthal. All the windows were open to catch the faint wind, and we had sat for a long time watching the Otzenthaler Alps turn rose-color over distant Innsbruck, then deepen to violet as the sun went down and the white mists rose slowly until Lichtwer and Lanneck and Kropsberg rose like craggy islands in a silver sea. And this is the story as Fraulein E. told it to us, the story of Kropsberg Keep. A great many years ago, soon after my grandfather died and Matzen came to us, when I was a little girl, and so young that I remember nothing of the affair except as something dreadful that frightened me very much, two young men who had studied painting with my grandfather came down to Brixleg from Munich, partly to paint and partly to amuse themselves. Ghost hunting, as they said, for they were very sensible young men and prided themselves on it, laughing at all kinds of superstition, and particularly at that form which believed in ghosts and feared them. They had never seen a real ghost, you know, and they belonged to a certain set of people who believed in nothing they had not seen themselves, which always seemed to me very conceited. Well, they knew that we had lots of beautiful castles here in the lower valley, and they assumed rightly that every castle has at least one ghost story connected with it, so they chose this as their hunting ground, only the game they sought was ghosts, not chamois. Their plan was to visit every place that was supposed to be haunted, and to meet every reputed ghost, and prove that it really was no ghost at all. There was a little inn down in the village then, kept by an old man named Peter Roskopf, and the two young men made this their headquarters. The very first night they began to draw from the old innkeeper all that he knew of legends and ghost stories connected with Brixleg and its castles, and as he was a most garrulous old gentleman, he filled them with the wildest delight by his stories of the ghosts of the castles about the mouth of the Zillerthal. Of course, the old man believed every word he said, and you can imagine his horror and amazement when, after telling his guests the particularly blood-curdling story of Kropsberg and its haunted keep, the elder of the two boys, whose surname I have forgotten but whose Christian name was Rupert, calmly said, "Your story is most satisfactory. We will sleep in Kropsberg Keep tomorrow night, and you must provide us with all that we may need to make ourselves comfortable." The old man nearly fell into the fire. "What for a blockhead are you?" he cried with big eyes. "The keep is haunted by Count Albert's ghost, I tell you." "That is why we are going there tomorrow night. We wish to make the acquaintance of Count Albert." "But there was a man who stayed there once, and in the morning he was dead." "Very silly of him. There are two of us, and we carry revolvers." "But it is a ghost, I tell you," almost screamed the innkeeper. "Are ghosts afraid of firearms?" Whether they are or not, we are not afraid of them." Here the younger boy broke in. He was named Otto von Kleist. I remember the name, for I had a music teacher once by that name. He abused the poor old man shamefully, told him that they were going to spend the night in Kropsberg in spite of Count Albert and Peter Roscoff, and that he might as well make the most of it and earn his money with cheerfulness. In a word, they finally bullied the old fellow into submission, and when the morning came he set about preparing for the suicide, as he considered it, with sighs and mutterings and ominous shakings of the head. You know the condition of the castle now, nothing but scorched walls and crumbling piles of fallen masonry. Well, at the time I tell you of, the keep was still partially preserved. It was finally burned out only a few years ago by some wicked boys who came over from Jenbach to have a good time. But when the ghost hunters came, though 2 of the lower floors had fallen into the crypt, the 3rd floor remained. The peasants said it could not fall, but that it would stay until the day of judgment, because it was in the room above that the wicked Count Albert sat watching the flames destroy the great castle and his imprisoned guests, and where he finally hung himself in a suit of armor that had belonged to his medieval ancestor, the first Count Kropsberg. No one dared touch him, and so he hung there for 12 years, and all the time venturesome boys and daring men used to creep up the turret steps and stare awfully through the chinks in the door at that ghostly mass of steel that held within itself the body of a murderer and suicide, slowly returning to the dust from which it was made. Finally it disappeared, none knew whither, and for another 12 years the room stood empty but for the old furniture and the rotting hangings. So when the 2 men climbed the stairway to the haunted room, they found a very different state of things from what exists now. The room was absolutely as it was left the night Count Albert burned the castle, except that all trace of the suspended suit of armor and its ghastly contents had vanished. No one had dared to cross the threshold, and I suppose that for 40 years no living thing had entered that dreadful room. On one side stood a vast canopied bed of black wood, the damask hangings of which were covered with mold and mildew. All the clothing of the bed was in perfect order, and on it lay a book, open and face downward. The only other furniture in the room consisted of several old chairs, a carved oak chest, and a big inlaid table covered with books and papers, and on one corner 2 or 3 bottles with dark, solid sediment at the bottom, and a glass, also dark with the dregs of wine that had been poured out almost half a century before. The tapestry on the walls was green with mold, but hardly torn or otherwise defaced, for although the heavy dust of 40 years lay on everything, the room had been preserved from further harm. No spider web was to be seen, no trace of nibbling mice, not even a dead moth or fly on the sills of the diamond-paned windows. Life seemed to have shunned the room utterly and finally. The men looked at the room curiously, and, I am sure, not without some feelings of awe and unacknowledged fear. But whatever they may have felt of instinctive shrinking, they said nothing, and quickly set to work to make the room passably inhabitable. They decided to touch nothing that had not absolutely to be changed, and therefore they made for themselves a bed in one corner with the mattress and linen from the inn. In the great fireplace they piled a lot of wood on the caked ashes of a fire dead for 40 years, turned the old chest into a table, and laid out on it all their arrangements for the evening's amusement. Food, 2 or 3 bottles of wine, pipes and tobacco, and the chessboard that was their inseparable traveling companion. All this they did themselves. The innkeeper would not even come within the walls of the outer court. He insisted that he had washed his hands of the whole affair. The silly dunderheads might go to their death their own way. He would not aid and abet them. One of the stable boys brought the basket of food and the wood and the bed up the winding stone stairs, to be sure, but neither money nor prayers nor threats would bring him within the walls of the accursed place, and he stared fearfully at the harebrained boys as they worked around the dead old room preparing for the night that was coming so fast. At length everything was in readiness, and after a final visit to the inn for dinner, Rupert and Otto started at sunset for the keep. Half the village went with them, for Peter Roscoff had babbled the whole story to an open-mouthed crowd of wondering men and women, and as to an execution, the awestruck crowd followed the two boys dumbly, curious to see if they surely would put their plan into action. But none went farther than the outer doorway of the stairs, for it was already growing twilight. In absolute silence they watched the two foolhardy youths with their lives in their hands enter the terrible keep, standing like a tower in the midst of the piles of stones that had once formed walls joining it with the mass of the castle beyond. When a moment later a light showed itself in the high windows above, they sighed resignedly and went their ways, to wait stolidly until the morning should come and prove the truth of their fears and warnings. In the meantime, the ghost hunters built a huge fire, lighted their many candles, and sat down to await developments. Rupert afterwards told my uncle that they really felt no fear whatsoever, only a contemptuous curiosity, and they ate their supper with good appetite and an unusual relish. It was a long evening. They played many games of chess, waiting for midnight. Hour passed after hour, and nothing occurred to interrupt the monotony of the evening. 10, 11 came and went. It was almost midnight. They piled more wood in the fireplace, lighted new candles, looked to their pistols, and waited. The clocks in the village struck 12, the sound coming muffled through the high, deep embrasured windows. Nothing happened, nothing to break the heavy silence, and with a feeling of disappointed relief, they looked at each other and acknowledged that they had met another rebuff. Finally, they decided that there was no use in sitting up and boring themselves any longer. They had much better rest, so Otto threw himself down on the mattress, falling almost immediately asleep. Rupert sat a little longer, smoking and watching the stars creep along behind the shattered glass and the bent leads of the lofty windows, watching the fire fall together and the strange shadows move mysteriously on the moldering walls. The iron hook in the oak beam that crossed the ceiling midway fascinated him, not with fear but morbidity. So it was from that hook that for 12 years, 12 long years of changing summer and winter, the body of Count Albert, murderer and suicide, hung in its strange casing of medieval steel, moving a little at first and turning gently while the fire died out on the hearth, while the ruins of the castle grew cold, and horrified peasants sought for the bodies of the score of gay, reckless, wicked guests whom Count Albert had gathered in Kropsberg for a last debauch, gathered to their terrible and untimely death. What a strange and fiendish idea it was, the young, handsome noble who had ruined himself and his family in the society of the splendid debauchees, gathering them all together, men and women who had known only love and pleasure, for a glorious and awful riot of luxury. And then, when they were all dancing in the great ballroom, locking the doors and burning the whole castle about them, the while he sat in the great keep listening to their screams of agonized fear, watching the fire sweep from wing to wing until the whole mighty mass was one enormous and awful pyre, and then, clothing himself in his great-great-grandfather's armor, hanging himself in the midst of the ruins of what had been a proud and noble castle. So ended a great family, a great house. But that was 40 years ago. He was growing drowsy. The light flickered and flared in the fireplace. One by one the candles went out. The shadows grew thick in the room. Why did that great iron hook stand out so plainly? Why did that dark shadow dance and quiver so mockingly behind it? Why? But he ceased to wonder at anything. He was asleep. It seemed to him that he woke almost immediately. The fire still burned, though low and fitfully on the hearth. Otto was sleeping, breathing quietly and regularly. The shadows had gathered close around him, thick and murky. With every passing moment, the light died in the fireplace. He felt stiff with cold. In the utter silence, he heard the clock in the village strike 2. He shivered with a sudden and irresistible feeling of fear, and abruptly turned and looked towards the hook in the ceiling. Yes, it was there. He knew that it would be. It seemed quite natural. He would have been disappointed had he seen nothing. But now he knew that the story was true, knew that he was wrong, and that the dead do sometimes return to Earth. For there, in the vast, deepening shadow, hung the black mass of wrought steel, turning a little now and then with the light flickering on the tarnished and rusty metal. He watched it quietly. He hardly felt afraid. It was rather a sentiment of sadness and fatality that filled him, of gloomy forebodings of something unknown, unimaginable. He sat and watched the thing disappear in the gathering dark, his hand on his pistol as it lay by him on the great chest. There was no sound but the regular breathing of the sleeping boy on the mattress. It had grown absolutely dark. A bat fluttered against the broken glass of the window. He wondered if he was growing mad, for, he hesitated to acknowledge it himself, he heard music. Far, curious music. A strange and luxurious dance, very faint, very vague, but unmistakable. Like a flash of lightning came a jagged line of fire down the blank wall opposite him, a line that remained, that grew wider, that let a pale, cold light into the room, showing him now all its details. The empty fireplace, where a thin smoke rose in a spiral from a bit of charred wood, the mass of the great bed, and in the very middle, black against the curious brightness, the armored man, or ghost, or devil, standing, not suspended, beneath the rusty hook. And with the rending of the wall, the music grew more distinct, though sounding still very, very far away. Count Albert raised his mailed hand and beckoned to him, then turned and stood in the riven wall. Without a word, Rupert rose and followed him, his pistol in his hand. Count Albert passed through the mighty wall and disappeared in the unearthly light. Rupert followed mechanically. He felt the crushing of the mortar beneath his feet, the roughness of the jagged wall where he rested his hand to steady himself. The keep rose absolutely isolated among the ruins, yet on passing through the wall, Rupert found himself in a long, uneven corridor, the floor of which was warped and sagging, while the walls were covered on one side with big, faded portraits of an inferior quality, like those in the corridor that connects the Pitti and Uffizi in Florence. Before him moved the figure of Count Albert, a blank silhouette in the ever-increasing light. And always the music grew stronger and stranger, a mad, evil, seductive dance that bewitched even while it disguised. In a final blaze of vivid, intolerable light, in a burst of hellish music that might have come from Bedlam, Rupert stepped from the corridor into a vast and curious room where at first he saw nothing, distinguished nothing but a mad, seething whirl of sweeping figures, white in a white room, under white light, Count Albert standing before him, the only dark object to be seen. As his eyes grew accustomed to the fearful brightness, he knew that he was looking on a dance such as the damned might see in hell, but such as no living man had ever seen before. Around the long, narrow hall, under the fearful light that came from nowhere but was omnipresent, swept a rushing stream of unspeakable horrors, dancing insanely, laughing, gibbering hideously, the dead of 40 years. White, polished skeletons, bare of flesh and vesture, skeletons clothed in the dreadful rags of dried and rattling sinews, the tags of tattering grave clothes flaunting behind them. These were the dead of many years ago. Then the dead of more recent times, with yellow bones showing only here and there, the long and insecure hair of their hideous heads writhing in the beating air. Then green and gray horrors, bloated and shapeless, stained with earth or dripping with spattering water, and here and there white, beautiful things like chiseled ivory, the dead of yesterday, locked, it may be, in the mummy arms of rattling skeletons. Round and round the cursed room, a swaying, swirling maelstrom of death, while the air grew thick with miasma, the floor foul with shreds of shrouds and yellow parchment, clattering bones and wisps of tangled hair. And in the very midst of this ring of death, a sight not for words nor thought, a sight to blast forever the mind of the man who looked upon it. A leaping, writhing dance of Count Albert's victims, the score of beautiful women and reckless men who danced to their awful death while the castle burned around them, charred and shapeless now, a living carnal house of nameless horror. Count Albert, who had stood silent and gloomy watching the dance of the damned, turned to Rupert and for the first time spoke. "We are ready for you now. Dance." A prancing horror dead some dozen years perhaps flaunted from the rushing river of the dead and leered at Rupert with eyeless skull. "Dance." Rupert stood frozen, motionless. "Dance." His hard lips moved. "Not if the devil came from hell to make me." Count Albert swept his vast two-handed sword into the fetid air while the tide of corruption paused in its swirling and swept down on Rupert with gibbering grins. The room and the howling dead and the black portent before him circled dizzily around, as with a last effort of departing consciousness, he drew his pistol and fired full in the face of Count Albert. Perfect silence. Perfect darkness. Not a breath, not a sound. The dead stillness of a long-sealed tomb. Rupert lay on his back, stunned, helpless, his pistol clenched in his frozen hand, a smell of powder in the black air. Where was he? Dead? In hell? He reached his hand out cautiously. It fell on dusty boards. Outside, far away, a clock struck 3. Had he dreamed? Of course, but how ghastly a dream. With chattering teeth, he called softly, "Otto." There was no reply, and none when he called again and again. He staggered weakly to his feet, groping for matches and candles. A panic of abject terror came on him. The matches were gone. He turned towards the fireplace. A single coal glowed in the white ashes. He swept a mass of papers and dusty books from the table, and with trembling hands cowered over the embers, until he succeeded in lighting the dry tinder. Then he piled the old books on the blaze, and looked fearfully around. No, it was gone. Thank God for that. The hook was empty. But why did Otto sleep so soundly? Why did he not awake? He stepped unsteadily across the room in the flaring light of the burning books and knelt by the mattress. So they found him in the morning, when no one came to the inn from Kropsberg Keep, and the quaking Peter Roscoff arranged a relief party, found him kneeling beside the mattress where Otto lay, shot in the throat and quite dead. End of In Kropsberg Keep. Section 3 of Black Spirits and White, a Book of Ghost Stories by Ralph Adams Cram. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Andrew Gauntz. The White Villa. When we left Naples on the 8:10 train for Peaston, Tom and I, we fully intended returning by the 2:46. Not because 2 hours' time seemed enough wherein to exhaust the interests of those deathless ruins of a dead civilization, but simply for the reason that, as our indicatore informed us, there was but one other train, and that at 6:11, which would land us in Naples too late for the dinner at the Turners and the San Carlo afterwards. Not that I cared in the least for the dinner or the theater, but then I was not so obviously in Miss Turner's good graces as Tom Rendell was, which made a difference. However, we had promised, so that was an end of it. This was in the spring of '88, and at that time the railroad, which was being pushed onward to Reggio, whereby travelers to Sicily might be spared the agonies of a night on the fickle Mediterranean, reached no further than Agropoli, some 20 miles beyond Peaston. But although the trains were as yet few and slow, we accepted the half-finished road with gratitude, for it penetrated the very center of Campanian brigandage, and made it possible for us to see the matchless temples in safety, while a few years before it was necessary for intending visitors to obtain a military escort from the government, and military escorts are not for young architects. So we set off contentedly that white May morning, determined to make the best of our few hours, little thinking that before we saw Naples again we were to witness things that perhaps no American had ever seen before. For a moment, when we left the train at Pesto and started to walk up the flowery lane leading to the temples, we were almost inclined to curse this same railroad. We had thought in our innocence that we should be alone, that no one else would think of enduring the long 4 hours ride from Naples just to spend 2 hours in the ruins of these temples. But the event proved our unwisdom. We were not alone. It was a compact little party of conventional sightseers that accompanied us. The inevitable English family with the 3 daughters, prominent of teeth, flowing of hair, aggressive of scarlet Murrays and Baedekers. The 2 blonde and untidy Germans, a French couple from the pages of La Vie Parisienne, and our old man of the sea, the white-bearded Presbyterian minister from Pennsylvania who had made our life miserable in Rome at the time of the Pope's Jubilee. Fortunately for us, this terrible old man had fastened himself upon a party of American school teachers traveling en cook, and for the time we were safe. But our vision of 2 hours of dreamy solitude faded lamentably away. Yet how beautiful it was, this golden meadow walled with far violet mountains, breathless under a May sun, and in the midst, rising from tangles of asphodel and acanthus vast in the vacant plain, 3 temples, one silver-gray, one golden-gray, and one flushed with intangible rose, and all around nothing but velvet meadows stretching from the dim mountains behind, away to the sea, that showed only as a thin line of silver just over the edge of the still grass. The tide of tourists swept noisily through the basilica and the temple of Poseidon across the meadow to the distant temple of Ceres, and Tom and I were left alone to drink in all the fine wine of dreams that was possible in the time left us. We gave but little space to examining the temples the tourists had left, but in a few moments found ourselves lying in the grass to the east of Poseidon, looking dimly out towards the sea, heard now but not seen, a vague and pulsating murmur that blended with the humming of bees all about us. A small shepherd boy with a woolly dog made shy advances of friendship, and in a little time we had set him to gathering flowers for us, asphodels and bee orchids, anemones, and the little thin green iris so fairy-like and frail. The murmur of the tourist crowd had merged itself in the moan of the sea, and it was very still. Suddenly I heard the words I had been waiting for, the suggestion I had refrained from making myself, for I knew Thomas. "I say, old man, shall we let the 246 go to thunder?" I chuckled to myself. "But the Turners?" "They be blowed. We can tell them we missed the train." "That is just exactly what we shall do," I said, pulling out my watch, "unless we start for the station right now." But Tom drew an acanthus leaf across his face and showed no signs of moving, so I filled my pipe again, and we missed the train. As the sun dropped lower towards the sea, changing its silver line to gold, we pulled ourselves together, and for an hour or more sketched vigorously. But the mood was not on us. It was too jolly fine to waste time working, as Tom said, so we started off to explore the single street of the squalid town of Pesto that was lost within the walls of dead Posidonia. It was not a pretty village, if you can call a rut-riven lane and a dozen houses a village, nor were the inhabitants thereof reassuring in appearance. There was no sign of a church, nothing but dirty huts, and in the midst one of 2 stories, rejoicing in the name of Albergo del Sol, the first story of which was a black and cavernous smithy, where certain swarthy knaves, looking like banditti out of a job, sat smoking sulkily. "We might stay here all night," said Tom, grinning askance at this choice company, but his suggestion was not received with enthusiasm. Down where the lane from the station joined the main road stood the only sign of modern civilization, a great square structure, half villa, half fortress, with round turrets on its 4 corners, and a 10-foot wall surrounding it. There were no windows in its first story, so far as we could see, and it had evidently been at one time the fortified villa of some Campanian noble. Now, however, whether because brigandage had been stamped out or because the villa was empty and deserted, it was no longer formidable. The gates of the great wall hung sagging on their hinges, brambles growing all over them, and many of the windows in the upper story were broken and black. It was a strange place, weird and mysterious, and we looked at it curiously. "There is a story about that place," said Tom with conviction. It was growing late. The sun was near the edge of the sea as we walked down the ivy-grown walls of the vanished city for the last time, and as we turned back, a red flush poured from the west and painted the Doric temples in pallid rose against the evanescent purple of the Apennines. Already a thin mist was rising from the meadows, and the temples hung pink in the misty grayness. It was a sorrow to leave the beautiful things, but we could run no risk of missing this last train, so we walked slowly back towards the temples. "What is that Johnny waving his arm at us for?" asked Tom suddenly. "How should I know? We're not on his land, and the walls don't matter." We pulled out our watches simultaneously. "What time are you?" I said. 6 minutes before 6. "And I am 7 minutes. It can't take us all that time to walk to the station." "Are you sure the train goes at 6:11? "Dead sure," I answered, and showed him the indicatore. By this time, a woman and 2 children were shrieking at us hysterically, but what they said I had no idea, their Italian being of a strange and awful nature. "Look here," I said, "let's run. Perhaps our watches are both slow. Or perhaps the timetable is changed." Then we ran, and the populace cheered and shouted with enthusiasm. Our dignified run became a panic-stricken rout, for as we turned into the lane, smoke was rising from beyond the bank that hid the railroad. A bell rang. We were so near that we could hear the interrogative pronte, the impatient partenza, and the definitive andiamo. But the train was 500 yards away, steaming towards Naples, when we plunged into the station as the clock struck 6 and yelled for the station master. He came, and we indulged in crimination and recrimination. When we could regard the situation calmly, it became apparent that the timetable had been changed 2 days before, the 6:11 now leaving at 5:58. A facchino came in, and we 4 sat down and regarded the situation judicially. Was there any other train? No. Could we stay at the Albergo del Sole? A forefinger drawn across the throat by the capo stazione with a significant cluck closed that question. Then we must stay with you here at the station. But, signori, I am not married. I live here only with the facchini. I have only 1 room to sleep in. It is impossible. But we must sleep somewhere, likewise eat. What can we do? And we shifted the responsibility deftly on the shoulders of the poor old man who was growing excited again. He trotted nervously up and down the station for a minute, then he called the facchino. "Giuseppe, go up to the villa and ask if 2 forestieri who have missed the last train can stay there all night." Protests were useless. The facchino was gone, and we waited anxiously for his return. It seemed as though he would never come. Darkness had fallen, and the moon was rising over the mountains. At last he appeared. "The signori may stay all night, and welcome, but they cannot come to dinner, for there is nothing in the house to eat." This was not reassuring, and again the old station master lost himself in meditation. The results were admirable, for in a little time the table in the waiting room had been transformed into a dining table, and Tom and I were ravenously devouring a big omelette and bread and cheese and drinking a most shocking sour wine as though it were shadowy. A facchino served us with clumsy goodwill, and when we had induced our nervous old host to sit down with us and partake of his own hospitality, we succeeded in forming a passably jolly dinner party, forgetting over our sour wine and cigarettes the coming hours from 10 until sunrise, which lay before us in a dubious mist. It was with crowding apprehensions which we strove in vain to joke away that we set out at last to retrace our steps to the mysterious villa, the facchino Giuseppe leading the way. By this time the moon was well overhead, and just behind us as we tramped up the dewy lane, white in the moonlight between the ink-black hedgerows on either side. How still it was. Not a breath of air, not a sound of life, only the awful silence that had lain almost unbroken for 2,000 years over this vast graveyard of a dead world. As we passed between the shattered gates and wound our way in the moonlight through the maze of gnarled fruit trees, decaying farm implements, and piles of lumber, towards the small door that formed the only opening in the first story of this deserted fortress, the The cold silence was shattered by the harsh baying of dogs somewhere in the distance to the right, beyond the barns that formed one side of the court. From the villa came neither light nor sound. Giuseppe knocked at the weather-worn door, and the sound echoed cavernously within, but there was no other reply. He knocked again, and at length we heard the rasping jar of sliding bolts, and the door opened a little, showing an old man bent with age and gaunt with malaria. Over his head he held a big Roman lamp with 3 wicks that cast strange shadows on his face. A face that was harmless in its senility, but intolerably sad. He made no reply to our timid salutations, but motioned tremblingly to us to enter, and with a last good night to Giuseppe we obeyed, and stood halfway up the stone stairs that led directly from the door, while the old man tediously shot every bolt and adjusted the heavy bar. Then we followed him in the semi-darkness up the steps into what had been the great hall of the villa. A fire was burning in a great fireplace so beautiful in design that Tom and I looked at each other with interest. By its fitful light we could see that we were in a huge circular room covered by a flat, saucer-shaped dome. A room that must once have been superb and splendid, but that now was a lamentable wreck. The frescoes on the dome were stained and mildewed, and here and there the plaster was gone altogether. The carved doorways that led out on all sides had lost half the gold with which they had once been covered, and the floor was of brick, sunken into treacherous valleys. Rough chests, piles of old newspapers, fragments of harnesses, farm implements, a heap of rusty carbines and cutlasses, nameless litter of every possible kind, made the room into a wilderness which under the firelight seemed even more picturesque than it really was. And on this inexpressible confusion of lumber the pale shapes of the 17th century nymphs, startling in their weather-stained nudity, looked down with vacant smiles. For a few moments we warmed ourselves before the fire, and then, in the same dejected silence, the old man led the way to one of the many doors, handed us a brass lamp, and with a stiff bow turned his back on us. Once in our room alone, Tom and I looked at each other with faces that expressed the most complex emotions. "Well, of all the rum goes," said Tom, "this is the rummiest go I ever experienced." "Right, my boy. As you very justly remark, we are in for it. Help me shut this door, and then we will reconnoiter, take account of stock, and size up our chances." But the door showed no sign of closing. It grated on the brick floor and stuck in the warped casing, and it took our united efforts to jam the 2 inches of oak into its place and turn the enormous old key in its rusty lock. "Better now, much better now," said Tom. "Now, let us see where we are." The room was easily 25 feet square and high in proportion. Evidently it had been a state apartment, for the walls were covered with carved paneling that had once been white and gold, with mirrors in the panels. The wood now stained every imaginable color, the mirrors cracked and broken and dull with mildew. A big fire had just been lighted in the fireplace, the shutters were closed, and although the only furniture consisted of 2 massive bedsteads and a chair with one leg shorter than the others, the room seemed almost comfortable. I opened one of the shutters that closed the great windows that ran from the floor almost to the ceiling, and nearly fell through the cracked glass into the floorless balcony. "Tom, come here quick," I cried, and for a few minutes neither of us thought about our dubious surroundings, for we were looking at Peaston by moonlight. A flat white mist like water lay over the entire meadow. From the midst rose against the blue-black sky the 3 ghostly temples, black and silver in the vivid moonlight, floating, it seemed, in the fog, and behind them, seen in broken glints between the pallid shafts, stretched the line of the silver sea. Perfect silence, the silence of implacable death. We watched the white tide of mist rise around the temples until we were chilled through, and so presently went to bed. There was but one door in the room, and that was securely locked. The great windows were 20 feet from the ground, so we felt reasonably safe from all possible attack. In a few minutes Tom was asleep and breathing audibly, but my constitution is more nervous than his, and I lay awake for some time thinking of our curious adventure and of its possible outcome. Finally I fell asleep, for how long I do not know, but I woke with the feeling that someone had tried the handle of the door. The fire had fallen into a heap of coals which cast a red glow in the room, whereby I could see dimly the outline of Tom's bed, the broken-legged chair in front of the fireplace, and the door in its deep casing by the chimney directly in front of my bed. I sat up, nervous from my sudden awakening under these strange circumstances, and stared at the door. The latch rattled, and the door swung smoothly open. I began to shiver coldly. That door was locked. Tom and I had all we could do to jam it together and lock it. But we did lock it, and now it was opening silently. In a minute more, it as silently closed. Then I heard a footstep. I swear I heard a footstep in the room, and with it the frou-frou of trailing skirts. My breath stopped, and my teeth grated against each other as I heard the soft footfalls and the feminine rustle pass along the room towards the fireplace. My eyes saw nothing, yet there was enough light in the room for me to distinguish the pattern on the carved panels of the door. The steps stopped by the fire, and I saw the broken-legged chair lean to the left, with a little jar as its short leg touched the floor. I sat still, frozen, motionless, staring at the vacancy that was filled with such terror for me. And as I looked, the seat of the chair creaked, and it came back to its upright position again. And then the footsteps came down the room lightly towards the window. There was a pause, and then the great shutters swung back, and the white moonlight poured in. Its brilliancy was unbroken by any shadow, by any sign of material substance. I tried to cry out, to make some sound, to awaken Tom. This sense of utter loneliness in the presence of the inexplicable was maddening. I don't know whether my lips obeyed my will or no. At all events, Tom lay motionless, with his deaf ear up, and gave no sign. The shutters closed as silently as they had opened. The moonlight was gone, the firelight also, and in utter darkness I waited. If I could only see! If something were visible, I should not mind it so much. But this ghastly hearing of every little sound, every rustle of a gown, every breath, yet seeing nothing, was soul-destroying. I think in my abject terror I prayed that I might see, only see, but the darkness was unbroken. Then the footsteps began to waver fitfully, and I heard the rustle of garments sliding to the floor, the clatter of little shoes flung down, the rattle of buttons and of metal against wood. Rigors shot over me, and my whole body shivered with collapse as I sank back on the pillow, waiting with every nerve tense, listening with all my life. The coverlid was turned back beside me, and in another moment the great bed sank a little as something slipped between the sheets with an audible sigh. I called to my aid every atom of remaining strength, and with a cry that shivered between my clattering teeth, I hurled myself headlong from the bed onto the floor. I must have lain for some time stunned and unconscious, for when I finally came to myself it was cold in the room. There was no last glow of lingering coals in the fireplace, and I was stiff with chill. It all flashed over me like the haunting of a heavy dream. I laughed a little at the dim memory, with the thought, I must try to recollect all the details. They will do to tell Tom. And I rose stiffly to return to bed, when there it was again, and my heart stopped, the hand on the door. I paused and listened. The door opened with a muffled creak, closed again, and I heard the lock turn rustily. I would have died now before getting into that bed again, but there was terror equally without, so I stood trembling and listened to heavy, stealthy steps creeping along on the other side of the bed. I clutched the coverlid, staring across into the dark. There was a rush in the air by my face, the sound of a blow, and simultaneously a shriek so awful, so despairing, so blood-curdling, that I felt my senses leaving me again as I sank crouching on the floor by the bed. And then began the awful duel, the duel of invisible, audible shapes, of things that shrieked and raved, mingling thin feminine cries with low, stifled curses and indistinguishable words. Round and round the room, footsteps chasing footsteps in the ghastly night, now away by Tom's bed, now rushing swiftly down the great room until I felt the flash of swirling drapery on my hard lips, round and round, turning and twisting till my brain whirled with the mad cries. They were coming nearer. I felt the jar of their feet on the floor beside me. Came one long, gurgling moan close over my head, and then, crushing down upon me, the weight of a collapsing body. There was long hair over my face and in my staring eyes, and as awful silence succeeded the less awful tumult, life went out, and I fell unfathomable miles into nothingness. The gray dawn was sifting through the chinks in the shutters when I opened my eyes again. I lay stunned and faint, staring up at the moldy frescoes on the ceiling, struggling to gather together my wandering senses and knit them into something like consciousness. But now, as I pulled myself little by little together, there was no thought of dreams before me. One after another, the awful incidents of that unspeakable night came back, and I lay incapable of movement, of action, trying to piece together the whirling fragments of memory that circled dizzily around me. Little by little, it grew lighter in the room. I could see the pallid lines struggling through the shutters behind me grow stronger along the broken and dusty floor. The tarnished mirrors reflected dirtily the growing daylight. A door closed far away, and I heard the crowing of a cock. Then, by and by, the whistle of a passing train. Years seemed to have passed since I first came into this terrible room. I had lost the use of my tongue. My voice refused to obey my panic-stricken desire to cry out. Once or twice I tried in vain to force an articulate sound through my rigid lips, and when at last a broken whisper rewarded my feverish struggles, I felt a strange sense of great victory. How soundly he slept. Ordinarily rousing him was no easy task, and now he revolted steadily against being awakened at this untimely hour. It seemed to me that I had called him for ages almost before I heard him grunt sleepily and turn in bed. "Tom," I cried weakly. "Tom, come and help me." "What do you want? What is the matter with you?" "Don't ask. Come and help me." "Fallen out of bed, I guess," and he laughed drowsily. My abject terror lest he should go to sleep again gave me new strength. Was it the actual physical paralysis born of killing fear that held me down? I could not have raised my head from the floor on my life. I could only cry out in deadly fear for Tom to come and help me. "Why don't you get up and get into bed?" he answered when I implored him to come to me. "You have got a bad nightmare. Wake up." But something in my voice roused him at last, and he came chuckling across the room, stopping to throw open two of the great shutters and let a burst of white light into the room. He climbed up on the bed and peered over jeeringly. With the first glance, the laugh died, and he leapt the bed and bent over me. "My God, man, what is the matter with you? You are hurt." "I don't know what is the matter. Lift me up, get me away from here, and I'll tell you all I know." "But, old chap, you must be hurt awfully. The floor is covered with blood." He lifted my head and held me in his powerful arms. I looked down. A great red stain blotted the floor beside me. But, apart from the black bruise on my head, there was no sign of a wound on my body, nor stain of blood on my lips. In as few words as possible, I told him the whole story. "Let's get out of this," he said when I had finished. "This is no place for us. Brigands I can stand, but..." He helped me to dress, and as soon as possible we forced open the heavy door, the door I had seen turn so softly on its hinges only a few hours before, and came out into the great circular hall, no less strange and mysterious now in the half-light of dawn than it had been by firelight. The room was empty, for it must have been very early, although a fire already blazed in the fireplace. We sat by the fire some time, seeing no one. Presently, slow footsteps sounded in the stairway, and the old man entered, silent as the night before, nodding to us civilly, but showing by no sign any surprise which he may have felt at our early rising. In absolute silence he moved around, preparing coffee for us. And when at last the frugal breakfast was ready, and we sat around the rough table munching coarse bread and sipping the black coffee, he would reply to our overtures only by monosyllables. Any attempt at drawing from him some facts as to the history of the villa was received with a grave and frigid repellence that baffled us, and we were forced to say addio with our hunger for some explanation of the events of the night still unsatisfied. But we saw the temples by sunrise, when the mist-like lambent opals bathed the bases of the tall columns salmon in the morning light. It was a rhapsody in the pale and unearthly colors of Puvis de Chavannes, vitalized and made glorious with splendid sunlight, the apotheosis of mist, a vision never before seen, never to be forgotten. It was so beautiful that the memory of my ghastly night paled and faded, and it was Tom who assailed the station master with questions while we waited for the train from Agropoli. Luckily, he was more than loquacious. He was voluble under the ameliorating influence of the money we forced upon him, and this, in few words, was the story he told us while we sat on the platform smoking, marveling at the mists that rose to the east, now veiling, now revealing the lavender Apennines. Is there a story of La Via Bianca? Ah, signori, certainly, and a story very strange and very terrible. It was much time ago, 100, 200 years, I do not know. Well, the Duca de San Damiano married a lady so fair, so most beautiful, that she was called La Luna di Pesto. But she was of the people. More, she was of the banditti. Her father was of Calabria and a terror of the Campagna. But the Duke was young, and he married her, and for her built the White Villa, and it was a wonder throughout Campania. You have seen. It is splendid now, even if a ruin. Well, it was less than a year after they came to the villa before the Duke grew jealous of the new captain of the banditti who took the place of the father of La Luna, himself killed in a great battle up there in the mountains. Was there cause? Who shall know? But there were stories among the people of terrible things in the villa, and how La Luna was seen almost never outside the walls. Then the Duke would go for many days to Napoli, coming home only now and then to the villa that was become a fortress. So many men guarded its never-opening gates. And once, it was in the spring, the Duke came silently down from Napoli, and there, by the 3 poplars you see away toward the north, his carriage was set upon by armed men, and he was almost killed. But he had with him many guards, and after a terrible fight the brigands were beaten off. But before him, wounded, lay the captain, the man whom he feared and hated. He looked at him lying there under the torchlight, and in his hand saw his own sword. Then he became a devil. With the same sword he ran the brigand through, leaped in the carriage, and, entering the villa, crept to the chamber of La Luna, and killed her with the sword she had given to her lover. This is all the story of the White Villa, except that the Duke never came again to Pesto. He went back to the king at Napoli, and for many years he was the scourge of the banditti of Campania, for the king made him a general, and San Damiano was a name feared by the lawless and loved by the peaceful, until he was killed in a battle down by Mormano. And La Luna? Some say she comes back to the villa, once a year when the moon is full in the month when she was slain. For the Duke buried her, they say, with his own hands, in the garden that was once under the window of her chamber. And as she died unshriven, so was she buried without the pale of the church. Therefore she cannot sleep in peace. Non è vero. I do not know if the story is true, but this is the story, signori. And there is the train for Napoli. Ah, grazie, signori, grazie tanto. Arrivederci, signori, arrivederci. End of The White Villa,